Yesterday we started on section 10, and I am intending to continue with that today. Yesterday we covered really only a very small part of section 10, which was concerned with the various classes of monads at the outset of their journey, and we looked at the broad picture, a broad brush picture of who the participants in this particular story were. Now, as we move on in section 10, concerned with the physical scheme, we get down to some quite specific information. In many respects, the information in this section is more readily intelligible than just about any other section. It ostensibly bears direct relationship to what we know. We talk about the history of the various races, and we talk about Atlantis and Lemuria and so forth. And with these sorts of subjects, we begin to feel that we are fairly close to home and we know what we're talking about. Well, let me pull the rug from under you for a moment. Let me ask you rhetorically, I don't expect you to answer, to consider this. Do you imagine that the writers of the Secret Doctrine were concerned with giving us history? The more I stop and think about it, the more I consider this highly unlikely. I can see little value in them having given us history. Why should they have bothered to tell us what went on in the fourth race and in the third race and in the second race? There is no value, no great value anyway. I suggest no great value in learning that sort of thing. And I think it far more likely that what we have been given here is what I would perhaps term as tradition rather than history. Now, I term it tradition for the following reason. A teacher of mine once said to me that the history of the school that she was attempting to teach was not that of factual history, although that would have been quite legitimate, but it was tradition. And she said it may or may not bear any relation to factual history. But the purpose of the tradition is to illustrate a number of points, and that it's all concerned with the training of the individual, and that the way in which the tradition is expressed has meaning to us in our present situation. And the more I thought about the way the apparent history in Volume 2 in Anthropogenesis is presented, I began to wonder whether the same was not true here as well. And that rather than, in fact, giving us history, they were giving us, in this sense, tradition. And it was an allegory, a metaphor, perhaps, rather than history. Now, the more I think about it, the more I prefer to see it in this light, and I'll tell you for why. Consider, for instance, if you will, if we were to, supposing we were visitors from another planet, and we were to arrive here and to walk through the ruins of our culture after we've destroyed ourselves with some nuclear weapons in the near future. I just toss this little cheerful thought in. And supposing they were to look through the ruins of our culture, what on earth would they know of us? They could look through the artifacts as we look through the artifacts of others, like the ruins of Pompeii and so forth, and the various other archaeological sites that we investigate. What do we actually know of the culture? Well, we can infer various things from the artifacts that they used and the ways in which they might have written and their arts and so forth. But what do we really know of the state of consciousness of the people involved? Very little, I suggest. The further removed those people are in time from us, the more difficult it becomes to know anything realistic about those people. After all, we have we can go back, 5,000, 6,000 years in terms of written history, and further back in terms of traditional history and so forth, but we have very little, in fact, to go on. And even what little we do, we're rapidly losing touch with the real culture, the real consciousness of the people as they would have lived their lives. Just walking through the ruins of London is going to tell you nothing about what I experienced when I walked through living London as it is today, nice and nasty and so forth. I am an embodiment, as indeed you are as well, an embodiment of our existing culture. And the culture is really the sum total of consciousnesses, the living people that populate the world, the cities, wherever else we choose to go. And it's that which is the important thing, not the artifacts that they use. I don't know whether you've had this experience, but I've walked around one or two archaeological sites and so forth, and you walk into a room and they say, well, this was the throne room. You know, you see this shabby wreck of a place, you know, with crumbling plaster on the walls and possibly a window. It doesn't look anything like a throne room or anything like that at all. You take the archaeologist's word for it because he tells you that it was so. But it bears no relation to that room as it would have been when it was a throne room. It was a throne room just because it was so in the consciousness of the people for whom it was a throne room. Not because it was so many walls coloured in this way with this painting and this on the floor, but just because it was sacred to and important to the people in whose consciousness it was a throne room. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's the consciousness which makes the race what it is, not the artifacts which make it what it is. Now, the story that appears in Anthropogenesis in this respect, and which this particular section has more to say about than any other, appears to be a history leading up to where we are today. But supposing you turn it round and were to view it in retrospect, in perspective, backward. Doing what we normally do, as historians would do, as archaeologists would do, we project back in a straight line our cultural standards and what little we know of life and art and architecture and all the other facets which make culture, and we try and project it onto what we think the past must have been. So, by analogy, the past goes back in a straight line. We project it in our minds backwards. But the further we get away from the present, the more reality, I suggest, diverges from that straight line. You can imagine that the two are moving apart like this, and that the further you go, in fact, in time backwards, the less likely it is to have been even remotely like any material civilization that we can encompass and guess about. Just let me finish this and then I'll come back to you. To look for remnants of civilizations like Atlantis and Lemuria, as we might be inclined to do in terms of trying to find artifacts, buildings, where they might have lived, cities and so forth, I suggest is probably a mistake. Isn't it? Do you not find it significant that in the last 100 years, since this explosion of interest in these lost cultures of Atlantis and Lemuria, we have found almost nothing. Instead of finding vast cities, which after all, if they were civilizations like ours, we should have found. Shouldn't have been that difficult. Do you imagine that we could wipe out all trace of our civilization that easily? We could do a lot of damage, but it would be difficult to wipe it out so completely that in a space of a few 100,000 years or even 1,000,000 years it would completely disappear. And yet we have found precious little of really convincing evidence that there ever was an Atlantis or a Lemuria or any other. Why? Because I think we're looking in the wrong place. I think we should be looking far more for the consciousness, shall we say, of that culture and civilization than the artifacts that made it up, the life rather than the form, to put it simply. And if you follow my thought, then what we are perceiving as we look backwards is a divergence. The one is the way in which the scientifically trained, the archaeologist and so forth, would look and would expect to find something consonant with the sorts of civilizations with which we're familiar. Whereas, in fact, what we're looking at is something which is diverging more and more and more from that. However, they have to use terms with which we are familiar. So this is why I say that what we see written, or what I suggest is what we see written, is allegory. So when, for instance, it says, as it does in one place in the stanzas in Anthropogenesis, that as early as the third race they were building cities. Yes, cities, because it's the only thing with which we will have an immediate understanding. Cities, we understand cities. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they were our sort of cities, even though it says they built them out of stone and so forth. Yes, but it's an allegory, it's a metaphor, I suggest. And I think a lot of what it passes for history is in fact allegory and metaphor. It was like that in consciousness. They would have had a similar experience in consciousness. City would have been as meaningful to them as city is to us, but the actual artifacts would have perhaps borne no resemblance at all to what we think of as city. So I think perhaps we need to interpret much of what is ostensibly history in this way and learn from it in a quite different way. Yes, Gunnar.
In fact, there is a new branch in history. I have read or looked at some of the books. They call it psychohistory. Try to get some hints of what has happened earlier.
What was going on in the mind and the soul, so to speak, rather than
to reconstruct their minds.
Yes.
Yes, but
yes.
When you visit Rennes, sometimes you can evoke the consciousness. I mean, you feel another person, you feel different.
Yes, I know what you mean, and I know that people do this. And perhaps because it's near enough to us, it's not that different, we can do this.
Egypt, for example.
But even so, I suspect we tend to judge by our standards, and we perhaps make reconstructions based on the way we feel today. But we have to bear in mind that our culture, certainly what I know of it in the West, I don't know much of what goes on in other cultures in the East and in China and so forth. I can only judge by what I know in the West. It's entirely possible, it seems to me, that the nature of life and consciousness, even in something as near as Egypt, was significantly different from what I expect.
I'm aware of that.
Yes, I just wonder how whether we have the sufficient imagination to genuinely reconstruct these things and not put onto it our sets of values.
But you are
I'm
taken
just making
by
a suggestion.
something, by your presence, and you are different, you feel different. You are not the 20th century person anymore.
True. This I fully grant you, because we envisage ourselves in a different set of circumstances, with a different set of people, with a different set of artifacts and so forth. But still and all, we still carry with ourselves a whole set of 20th century assumptions which it is not so easy to discard. Yes, we can absorb the spirit of the place and imagine ourselves as living at that time perhaps, but nonetheless we still carry with us our education, our background, our assumptions, our ideas, our memories and so forth, and I suggest that it's not quite so easy to let go of those, and it's that which makes us so different from people in the past and so forth, rather than the more external factors of it. Yes, Joy?
Since H.P.B. wrote The Secret Doctrine, I mean, not only have there been advances in science, but there are whole new schools of historiography. And it's interesting how the feeling in some of the contemporary schools of historiography have altered our view, and very much along the lines you're saying. While this hasn't necessarily seeped down into all our educational system, at least in the States, there are historians concerned psychological, the psycho-mental atmosphere of the people who did these things, or who were responsible for the few artifacts we have. So this is very true, and I think it substantiates precisely what you're saying.
Even if we look at the diversity of of cultures that we do have direct access to today, we see. I think we see some of this, especially where we look at some of the, in inverted commas, more primitive cultures, which are that much more different from the ones with which we have more direct access. I think the very fact that it is so difficult for us to appreciate the consciousness of some of these in primitive cultures, we see just how different they might have been. But they are cultures, every bit as much as we're cultures, but in many respects have no artifacts as we would recognize artifacts at all. I'm thinking of for instance, the Bushmen of the Kalahari, who clearly had a highly developed culture in the broadest sense of the word, but had very little in the way of artifact. And in time, the whole thing could have been erased.
Vanderpost is one who's been very much influenced by this new view of history. And there have been hot debates in the United States about what Margaret Mead did in pointing out that she took the 20th century values into her Samoan Island.
Yes, yes, I've read that. Yes, yes. And the whole thing has been called into question, the work that she did. Yes.
But some psychic are capable of coming back to this civilizations and
perhaps
the
so.
spirit of it.
Yes, perhaps so. Well, this comes back to something that Jeffrey was saying earlier this afternoon. It is possible, but it's most unusual.
Personality, completely.
Yes, but most of us are not capable of doing this. It's something that we need to. It's an area of ourselves which we perhaps need to develop if we are to have any real appreciation of what has gone before. So this is really a preamble only to this section, or bits of this. I don't propose to do any more of this tomorrow, so I'm just going to pick some bits out of section 10 now, and the particular areas that if you've read it and you'd like to comment on or ask about, please feel fairly free to do so, because there's no particular structure to what I'm about to say. I'm just going to pick out some ideas at random. One of the things which I think is of interest and is instructive is a point which is raised in 10.6, firstly on page 33, and there are some references which elucidate this on page 106. And this is the question of the development of the senses. At a first look at this, we find that the senses, the five senses with which we are familiar now, are said to have developed cumulatively one on another as the five races or major stages of development of mankind have been undertaken. And you see in that passage on 106 the equivalence of the elements to the senses, and I think it says actually in there, or possibly in another one nearby, that they develop. Yes, so you can see at the paragraph immediately under the table, as it says, as seen, each element adds its own characteristics to those of its predecessors, as each root race adds the characterizing sense of the preceding race. So the first race would have had one sense, that of sound or hearing, the second hearing and touch, the third hearing, touch and sight, and so forth, cumulatively. Well, that's the basic idea, but then we need to modify this fairly considerably, I believe. Firstly, when we say that we would have developed hearing in the first race, it's got to have been significantly different from hearing as we know it now, because we wouldn't have had any of these. Ears. And if you didn't have ears, you might say to yourself, how could you have heard anything? Each of these senses that we talk about, as we saw when we were talking about the elements, really represents a mode of perceiving, and the organ through which you happen to do the perceiving is relatively minor. At this stage in our relatively physical development, it happens that hearing takes place through ears, but it need not necessarily be that way. There is a faculty.
Bone conduction. That's
What of it? Ah.
Bone conduction.
Yes, yes, but there's still got to be an auditory nerve excited either by bone conduction or by sound waves for us to hear. It's all more or less.
Right inside, yes.
Yes.
The ear as such is not involved.
No, true. It seems that there are we have to distinguish then the sense from the mechanism, the organ through which the perception takes place. And as we see in psychics and so forth, the function and the organ can be turned around, and you can see sounds and hear colours, as they say. So we can dissociate the function from the organ.
Yes, you can see through the tip of the nose as well.
Apparently so. Apparently so. Which indicates that the mode of perception is something more subtle, more fundamental, shall we say, than the temporary mechanism through which we happen to carry out those functions as we're presently constituted. So when we talk of the first race having hearing, the second having touch, the third sight, these will probably, almost certainly, have been significantly different from anything with which we are immediately familiar. Again, it is slightly allegory and metaphor to say that they had hearing and touch. Yes, but considerably modified from what we are familiar with. If we were to take as a brief example, sight, for instance, I think I've elaborated this in one of the places. The third race is supposed to have developed sight, but that sight was associated with what we now call the third eye. Now, forgetting for a moment any connections with the third eye, with the pineal gland and the like, the third eye, as it was originally developed, wasn't a third eye, it was a first eye. And these would have been the second and third eyes when they came along a little later on. It's only third from our point of view, and we think this is the first two, and the third one was something else. But from the point of view of the third race which would have developed this, it would have been the first eye. And it was not associated with physical sight. The third race was not a physical race in its origins, and therefore the sight that they would have had would have been of a very different order to the sort of sight that we now talk about. This is just to illustrate the way in which the differences in these senses go. We have not yet completed our cycle, and in the sixth and seventh races, two new senses will be developed. What are they? Well, there's a little passage that I'd like to read you from one of HPB's letters to Sinnett. It's in fact one that Joy was directing your attention to only the other day. And she makes a comment about this, the next sense that we're due to get, and fascinating. You wouldn't have guessed that this was what was coming. You couldn't have expected this, I don't think. The sixth sense is the perception of realities and truth in the invisible worlds, those we can reach, of course, she puts in brackets, and of truth and fact on earth. All the words and sentences of a speech become coloured. It is easy to, because they become coloured, it is easy at once. It's easy to see at once by the colour that accompanies the sound when truth is spoken, or a lie, a fact given, or a distortion of it. So you will develop a truth sense, yeah, rather than it being an objective sense out there, a truth sense. Isn't that interesting?
No need to take an oath in court.
No, indeed. No, indeed. That was on page 257. 257. HPB's Letters to Synod. It's in letter 120. 257. Another idea which...
Does she say what the next one will be?
No, she doesn't. I'm afraid not. No, she doesn't go on. The next idea that I want to introduce is in 10.7 in the book, which is the idea that the evolution of physical forms takes place in two planes. This whole process of involution and evolution is summarized in a diagram. If you want to have a look at it, it's on page, I think, 300 in volume 2. It's probably one in Geoffrey's notes. We need not go into details of the ins and outs of this diagram, but if you care to look up page 300 in volume 2, you will see therein that the evolution of the races takes place in a spiral. It starts with the first race and relatively follows an involutionary or descending arc into materiality, density, and then an ascending arc through the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th races, reaching a higher point from that from which it started. Now, I don't know how literally one is supposed to interpret this diagram. Probably it's only intended to be a suggestion rather than to be taken in detail. Broadly speaking, this is supposed to involve evolution through two planes, the astral and the physical, and that the first and second races, and indeed the first part of the third, were entirely astral. We shall have to explore what we mean by these terms in a minute. Descending gently into a semi-astral, semi-physical state by the middle of the third, becoming entirely physical by the fourth. We, the fifth, have already started our ascending arc, and in a passage which I think Joy has already read you from the end of part 1 of volume 2, we will, during the 6th and 6th race, start to leave behind what she calls our coats of flesh, or something, some dramatic expression like that, and return to our astral condition again in the 6th and 7th races. Now, there's something faintly puzzling about all of this. You might recall from what Joy was saying, and what I was saying too, that between two planes there's supposed to be a lyre centre, isn't there? Mm-hmm. And you would imagine that there was a point of discontinuity between one plane and another, as you went through your lyre centre and disappeared from one plane and reappeared on the next plane and so forth. But it's not described in that way at all in Anthropogenesis. She describes this process as one of gradual and gentle transformation, of the astral gently, so to speak, condensing, crystallizing, coalescing, solidifying. I don't know how you want to think of it. Just as steam condenses into water and water freezes into ice and so forth. A gradual and continuous process of modification of an ethereal astral form into a material physical form. There appears to be no point where you could say it stops being astral and starts being physical. The whole process is a gradual one. So that is something that you have to add to what both Joy and I have already told you about planes and lyre centres and the difference between one plane and another. Within this context.
It's sort of like the wave particle.
Yes, indeed.
Light,
yes.
Both of which are true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so. I think so.
I think perhaps on globe D, she's using an astral in a loose sense there, because she
very likely
uses almost as an equivalent what you've just used, ethereal, as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's all physical, really. This is how I see it.
I shall hold you to that one of these days, Geoffrey. I shall hold you to that.
As I see it now.
I have argued this point with Geoffrey previously, and on those occasions he said that astral was astral, physical was physical, and it didn't mean that the two were part of one thing. Now he's changing his tune.
Maybe.
He's backing out now, you see.
Well, I'm leaving a door just
Yes.
at the back.
Yes. Now, having presented that little picture, which is supported by passages that you can see in 10.7 on 106, where she talks of this process, quoted you a passage there. We need not read it in detail now. Think of that in terms of what I was saying in my preamble to this talk about the process being metaphor and allegory. Do you see now that it could be that what they're calling physical is what corresponds to our present perception of the world, and that what they regard as astral, which is both before and after, as it moves away from our present consciousness, is becoming more what one would describe in terms of metaphor and allegory. It is true, but it is not literally true. It is an approximation of the truth, which appeals to our consciousness rather more than to our factual history. And so as it moves away in time, so it's also going to disappear in terms of artifact and record. Thoughts to conjure with. Now we looked yesterday at the points covered in 10.8, so I have nothing more to say about that for the moment. Points in 10.9 are interesting but not of immediate relevance. I would strongly suggest that you read the 10.9 parallel in page 107, 108. There's a long passage there which gives you a bird's eye picture of the process of physical evolution during the preceding 3 rounds. It's quoted in the SD, but the original comes in the Mahatma letters. And it's one of the few places where anything is said concerning the previous rounds. And again, it's given very much as a broad brush overview picture, very much worth reading. However, I don't really think that we have the time to explore that. The crucial point, I think, which we have yet to cover, emerges in 10.10. It's the crucial point of the outset of what will become the first race. Where did the basis of human form come from? As we described it previously, we have seen that between one round and the next, we leave behind those that we refer to as the seed humanity, the Shishta, whose function it is to maintain the development that has been undertaken in the, in quotes, physical world up till that point. These are they we now call the lunar Petries, the Bahishad Petries, the lunar ancestors, and 27 other terms that Joy has told us exist. These are, as we saw yesterday, part and parcel of the human kingdom, class 1 monads and so forth. And now it is that they act. At the outset of what will become the first race, they have to produce human form. Now the way it's described is rather interesting. They use a number of phrases to describe this process. They, out of their own essence, and these beings are said to be with form, so they are in some sense objective. To some set of perceptions, they are objective beings. They produce replicas, doubles, of their own ethereal form. And it is these doubles, moulds, models, which become the physical basis for the incarnation of the monads of classes 2, 3 and 4 who follow behind. This is, to put it as simply as I can, what's actually there in anthropogenesis. The way in which she suggests it happens actually ties in with what Geoffrey was saying this afternoon about she actually likens it to what takes place at a séance. There's a passage, one of the ones I've actually quoted, on page 109, if you want to follow it. Talking of this process, she says, "For who of those who have witnessed the phenomena of a materializing form oozing out of the pores of a medium, or at times out of his left side, can fail to credit the possibility, at least, of such a birth?" So the forms which will be used for the incoming monads are born in such a way. This is why they are called the ancestors. They are literally the parents, the fathers of these forms. There are various other passages where this is described. I've shown you one above, where it says, "They throw off their shadows or astral bodies, if such an ethereal being as a lunar spirit may be supposed to rejoice in an astral beside a hardly tangible body." The ways in which this is described are again very difficult to pin down. The forms that they produce are referred to as chayas, shadows. Now, I suggest that this term shadow that they use here is very suggestive. It's not purely to indicate just how insubstantial they are, which anything which is shadowy, of course, is relatively insubstantial. But it is, how do you cast a shadow? Well, the light's on one side, the object comes in between it, and the shadow is cast. But it requires the object to be there permanently in order for it to continue to cast the shadow. The object, which is casting the shadow, is integral with the shadow. You can't remove the object and hope that the shadow is going to continue to exist. Do you see what I'm saying? That the object, in this case these lunar dhyānis, are permanently involved. They can't just cast off a few shadows and then waltz off somewhere else, as I see it. This process is a continuous one. And this is borne out because a little later on, it says, I've lost it. Maybe I didn't quote it. Maybe that's why I can't find it. There is a passage where it says that the lunar dhyānis, having done this, having oozed out these doubles in this particular way, then share the fate of the first race. In other words, it's not a one-off act that they perform, and having done this in a generous sort of way, then go off and do something else, but share the fate of the first race which then follows. In other words, whatever it is that they have endowed us with, they have to continue to sustain. Rather in the way, as we shall see later in section 11, when we talk of those who endow us with mind, it is not a one-off act, here's your mind, plop, get on with it, but a continuous act of having to endow, enrich, underpin, enliven, awaken mind. So in a similar fashion, I suggest, do these who perform in this way have to sustain the whole stream of physical evolution.
Was the quotation you were looking for one that says they in fact become the first race?
Yes.
Well, you have quoted it, and
Ah.
I can't find it.
Thank you for this great help, Geoffrey.
You pointed it out to us.
Yeah.
I wish people wouldn't laugh.
Well, you're supposed to be able to help
It's
me.
mocking.
Well, you're mocking. You're mocking. Poor Adam.
Well, I'm not. I'm restoring his confidence.
There you have an 1,
10, 11.
12,
So 10, 11.
10, 12,
11.
10, 11. Yeah, 10, 12 too. The self-born where the shadows, and then
I expect I have, but I
it
don't see
means
it.
that the first root rays, the shadows of the progenitors could not be healed somehow. It's something different.
Well, we're all looking at that.
Yeah, got you all self-activated now.
And isn't that the passage, SB 180, where it starts with the lunar monad of Fifty, the ancestors of man becoming reality?
Man himself,
Then
yes,
it goes on, there are the monads
yes,
who enter on the cycle of evolution on
Yes.
that day, and then it goes
Yes.
on. Then
it's that phrase, become in reality man himself, which I think is the crucial one here. These creative acts, which are performed by the various groups or hierarchies who are responsible for helping in this process of the construction of man as he finds himself today, provide essences which are permanently needed. They cannot withdraw this effort and hope that it's going to be a self-sustaining one. We need them to continue to perform this function for
what
us.
is so interesting, it after what you've quoted, it goes on, for these lunar spirits have to become men
Mm.
in order that their monads
Mm.
may reach a higher plane of activity and self-confidence.
True,
So that
true.
ties it all together.
Yes, that's what follows on. They have not yet, even exalted though they be, they still have not yet reached the plane, as it says with the Manasaputras. They have not yet developed that degree of self-sustaining self-consciousness which would entitle them to join the ranks of
So
the
they learn their true
Manasaputras.
humanity.
Sure, by being part and parcel of us. But they learn faster, like the proverb that the teacher learns more than the pupil. So they will get much more out of the experience than we will, and that's why they're class 1. Right. Yes. The passages which follow now look at some of the aspects of what are involved in the ensuing developmental stages. We stress, I stress certainly, and I think others do as well, that we must not get carried away by this term race. Joy has already said what a dreadful term race and root race is for what is actually implied here. It's a great pity that the term was ever coined. You seem to imply that it was Sinnett that coined it. Do we know that for sure?
Well, only that there is a letter, I don't have the exact reference now, in which, in connection with it, the master says that
You are the author of...
you use this term and we'll settle for it.
Yes.
But because our terms are
Untranslatable.
really untranslatable.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's another
So
place
the
where...
implication is that it's the term root race that was rather coined by
Yes.
Sinnett.
Yes, there's certainly a lot of that about terminology. You are the author of rounds and races, I think he says in one place. And yes. And it apparently caused a lot of confusion in the early days of lip confusion, he says in one place.
Page 107.
What could be other thoughts that might round out the feeling for us that if a race or a root race is put together suitably?
Well, the trouble is...
I don't ask you to find another word,
No, no.
obviously you can't, but...
Well, the trouble with the word race is that it has so much physical connotation, that it has the connotation of physical types,
I see.
whether it be a Negro type or a Caucasian type or whatever. We think of instinctively that it has something intrinsically to do with physical characteristics, whereas I think we should be seeing it in terms of psychological, psycho-spiritual, shall we say, stages of development. After all, the whole cyclic process is that of developing and unfolding our sevenfold principles, and therefore, presumably, in this sevenfold cycle that we go through on the earth, we are in miniature repeating that process. So the races as they have been called, really represent stages of the process of unfolding our sevenfold constitution within this environment. As it happens, it will correspond to physical racial stocks through which those will be expressed. But those are minor, relatively minor expressions of an inner spiritual, psychospiritual development. This is why it's so misleading, we think.
I was told that Hitler had studied theosophy, but that it understood it wrongly.
Very likely, yes. There are some explosive statements made, some of which I've quoted in the book, just to be nice and controversial, concerning races, which, if misunderstood, and I think they were misunderstood, weren't they, Joy, and in times gone by, could lead to all sorts of accusations of racialism and the like, and lead to ideas of master races and all sorts of things like that.
I want an apology.
You do?
Page 107, third paragraph at the bottom.
Yes.
107. And you done it.
It's there. Yes, that's the one I wanted. I don't know why I couldn't see it. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Jeffrey.
The 1009, no?
In 10.8,
Oh, yeah.
the second passage towards the bottom, they're creating the semblances of men out of their own divine essence means esoterically that it is they who become the first race. So although we say that they created semblances, that is an allegory, meaning esoterically that they become the first race. So whether the one is more literal than the other, I don't know. She sometimes says, there was another place where she uses this term esoterically very freely, and if what Ianthe said to us merely means that it is for the few, then she is using it, I suspect, in a rather different sense. So it reads just as well as for the few, I suppose, as in any other. There's another place where she uses this term, and she says, esoterically, though whether you will be any the wiser, she says, for having told you this, it's a moot point. Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. You have my grovelling apology. Yes.
To confuse the issue, it's on page 92 of volume 2.
Yes.
This is what is publicly, because later you see that she makes the statement, but then here she quotes, presumably again from, I think, from her occult commentary. Having projected their shadows and made men of one element, the progenitors reascend
To Mahaloka.
Now, how can they become the first race and also reascend?
Well, I've thought about that a good deal. I remember years ago asking Geoffrey Barborca what that meant, and he gave me an extremely cryptic answer. He said that they returned to Globe C, which I found extremely difficult to accept. I don't go along with that, but I just toss it into the discussion for good measure. But I think it relates to the subject you touched on earlier from the letter that HBB wrote, where she touches on, or more than touches on, expounds the doctrine of the locus and talis. And in that she very much equates them as states pertaining to each globe. So each globe, our globe D, and it has these 14 states of the locus and talis and so forth, and therefore clearly primarily relate to states of consciousness.
Yeah, that's the way I would take it, that at the same time, they return to their own state of consciousness.
Yes. While yet underpinning whatever creative act that they have undertaken on behalf of the physical stream of mankind's evolution.
Well, that's the way I but I wanted to know if
Yes.
So far of the mark.
No, well, I mean, join the club. This is how I view it. We can both be wrong together.
Well, it's always more comforting.
Well, it is, yes. Yeah, we can share our ignorance with one another. Mm. Mm. Another principle which is illustrated. No, let me rephrase that. Which illustrates something that I've said earlier, is this process of recapitulation and foreshadowing and so forth, which is illustrated here. As we talk of the first and second and third races and so forth, we find that these, in this particular instance, are said to recapitulate earlier stages that we have gone through. And this, I think, is worth spending a moment or two on. A little while ago, I drew your attention to a lengthy passage, which is quoted on page 108, wherein you have a summary of the stages of evolution for man in the 4 rounds. Never mind this globe. But there are some key phrases there. Let me just draw your attention to some of these. In the first few lines, we're getting some information about the first round. Man in the first round and the first race on globe D. Now, do you see immediately, he's effectively saying whatever happened in the first round is repeated in the first race on globe D. The two are closely tied together. In both of those, man was an ethereal being. Da-da-da-da. And then a little later on, 4 lines down, on the law of analogy in the first race of the 4th round. On the law of analogy. Whatever you do in one is repeated analogously in the other. And in the paragraph describing the 3rd round, just above where the description of the 4th round starts, you see there's some part in brackets at the bottom. Mm. All this, that is the 3rd round, all this is almost exactly repeated in the 3rd root race of the 4th round. Yeah.
So it be a close of brackets thing?
Oh dear, yes there should. Thank you for the belated proofreading. So a lot of what we see in the description in anthropogenesis, although it describes only the first 4.5 races on this globe, has enormous implications. Just as she says, on the law, as Mahatma says in this case, on the law of analogy, the same has been happening in the preceding rounds. So we do have a little bit of insight into what those appropriate rounds would have been there to accomplish.
Yes, and although we're never told by analogy again, this might be going on in globe C and backwards.
Presumably so, but presumably it's equally unproductive for us to speculate on the nature of what goes on those globes. Right. Just picking ideas out again moderately at random. One of the other themes which is apparent in anthropogenesis comes back to, again, what I said in my preamble. She associates the development of the races with associated continents. She talks of, certainly in her introductory notes to Volume 2, where she gives us a sort of bird's-eye summary of what will happen in each of the races, she talks about the continents associated with them. Now, I suggest that what I said originally concerning the use of metaphor and allegory applies here. Of the first continent, which she calls the imperishable sacred land, she uses a phrase which I have quoted here quite deliberately. On page 111, if you want to follow this, talking of this in the introduction, she says, "It is proposed then to call the first continent, or rather the first terra firma on which the first race evolved by the divine progenitors, the imperishable sacred land." Now, I've commented on this immediately following it, and I've said, why the qualification, or rather, the first terra firma? Terra firma merely means firm land. What's the subtle distinction between that and a continent? Unless there never was, as we would historically construe it, geologically construe it, there never was any such continent. The description given, as if it were historical, as if it were geological, she describes it as a continental landmass which would have entirely covered the North Pole. There certainly is no such continent at the North Pole right now. Whether there ever has been is open to speculation. With the ideas of continental drift, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but there isn't now.
She does refer to there was an imperishable land.
Yes,
so
indeed.
It's the Vajra land, the Vajra throne, on which enlightenment will eventually take place.
I think so. I think
And
so.
that would be at the North Pole.
Of course.
Yes, that's
Of
nice.
course. You see, it's
That's
all.
the centre of the pivot,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes.
Lovely.
Yes.
I like
Exactly
that.
so.
What's going on now between you?
Oh, sorry.
Oh well.
The Vajra is the only indestructible substance. On our level, it might be likened to diamond or crystal or something like that. It is its essence, its transparency, and its nature is that of being able to refract all the colours that exist. But this level of Vajra that HPB was talking about, and which is in the Tibetan background, it is the Vajra seat, the seat made of this, the ground made of this imperishable substance, which is the ground on which you will sit when you become enlightened.
Looking at it then, in terms of allegory and metaphor, this sort of thing fits in very well, I think, with the sort of picture that I'm painting.
And it's the pivot now on which the
Yes.
world is turning.
Yes. Gradually, as we move towards where we are now, the allegory meets the reality, and there is less and less difference between the allegory and the reality. But the further we go away from it, the less similarity there is between what we assume to be the reality, a physical continent, and the allegory, which is what you might call the metaphysical continent. It's real in terms of consciousness and experience and everything else, but not necessarily having any correspondence to any physical continent within our ken.
On the other hand, Adam, the theory now current of tectonic plates would indicate that there are portions of the present continental land masses which were in other configurations.
Yes.
And have drifted, and therefore there's a part of one of our northwestern states, Idaho, in which a portion of the land mass has already been geologically, compared to Australia, quite adrift, and does not relate to the land mass, geologically speaking, immediately adjacent to it. So that there has been a reformation of
Yes.
continental
Yes.
land masses in this new theory.
Yes.
Widely accepted.
Yes. I have made some comments about this as well, in relation certainly to the third and fourth continents, the
This
so-called
is really
continents of.
in particular, the third and fourth continents.
Yes. Yes. It's very tempting to make these, to draw these parallels. I've made speculations in here as to what some of these might have been, what they talk of as Gondwana land and Laurasia and so forth, as to what they might have been and whether they had any correlations with the descriptions given of Lemuria and Atlantis. And it may be that they do. It may be that the convergence by that time is near enough
That's what I was wondering,
for
if
there
the
to be a
convergence
correspondence.
was coming closer by the third and fourth.
Yes, and it may be that there is, by that time, a genuine parallel.
Yes.
But even if there is, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will ever find remnants of artifacts
Not at all.
of those. That there is a convergence, but not necessarily yet an identity. It's an interesting area to explore.
It's interesting now that it seems that there are fossils and things recording some fourth round happenings in the ocean bed and surviving things like the coelacanth that comes a form from that time. It's remarkable that there are no human happenings. No
Not
human
yet.
happenings.
Not yet, no. But looked at on a purely factual basis, would there necessarily be so anyway? I mean, this whole process of astral to physical to astral, as described, would strongly suggest that we're not likely to find those sorts of remnants anyway.
Tell me, do the places, I mean, I have no knowledge of this, as you know, do the continents as suggested form a mandala?
Not that I had ever conceived of, no.
No, I wonder.
No, don't believe so.
Thank you.
There's not a lot of detail, not
No.
enough detail given. There are all sorts of suggestive hints and clues, but never any, never enough really to construct what one might would call a map.
Adam, is it possible that at the same way that minerals become in radioactivity, the astral shadow is a radiation or projection when the life is changed from one plane to another? For example, when the light from mineral come to the vegetable, I think they become inactivity, radioactivity, I think. Maybe the same process.
I don't know enough to comment on that.
When you are looking for another evolution in the beginning, the first planet in another chain, higher, you have to keep out the lower vehicle. You project it like a radioactivity, I think.
You could be right. I just don't know enough to comment intelligently on that. Anything else? I don't really propose to go through too much of this because most of it, I think and I hope, would be moderately intelligible just to read straight through. So unless you've got any specific questions to ask about this, I don't know that there's a great deal more that I want to go through in detail here. And in fact, while you're thinking of some questions, we will have a quick commercial break. Those, Joy gave you the meaning this morning, those who sit by or tend their fires, I believe. By Shad? Joy? Yes. Is it not also a connotation of tending those fires?
Yes, tending, they tend them, but they don't get warmed by them, sweetened by them, as they are neglected.
No, thanks.
On page 114, near the bottom, 5 lines up, you say, you suggest that what is now referred to as, by whom is it referred to? Is it modern geology?
Yes, modern geology.
I haven't come across.
Aha. Yes.
Very much accepted in modern geology.
Yes. The general picture is that, using their timescales, is that at about 600 million years ago, all the landmass on the globe made one supercontinent, which they call, can't remember what they call that. No, that was all. No, there was. They have a name for the whole thing, but I can't remember. Pangaea. Pangaea, they call that. All Earth. And then the picture is that then that split into two what they call supercontinents. In the north there was Laurasia, which included most of Asia, North America, and so forth. And in the south, Gondwanaland, which was South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. And this was a supercontinent. And that was a relatively stable configuration until about 300 million years ago, when those in turn started to break up into smaller continents. And there is a lot of good, solid evidence that this is the way in which they have developed. Therefore, the phrase that I quoted on that page, which is just this tiny little reference from the SD, where it says that when the gigantic continent of Lemuria began separating into smaller continents is so suggestive. You see, that is so contrary to most theosophical pictures that you're given of, which was based on 19th century geology, of a series of pre-existing continents which really didn't change, and merely the sea levels rose and fell. This is a radically different picture.
What year did you estimate? How many? 500 million?
I'm guessing. I don't hold the figures actually in my mind, but I think it was about 600 million years ago. It was reckoned that it was all one land mass. I remember 300 million years ago was one of the critical points where I think the two major supercontinents split apart. But they're still doing an awful lot of research into exactly which plates moved where and so forth. Well, you've got another 5 minutes if you want it. Are there any questions on this subject that you'd like to raise? You might notice, might just draw your attention to, we were talking about races and some of the statements made by the Mahatmas concerning races, which I said were a little incendiary or explosive in their connotations. 1021, which you can see on page 116, for instance, the passage quoted from the Mahatma letters. Where it says right in the middle of the page, for instance, the majority of mankind belongs to the 7th subrace of the 4th root race, which might have come as a big surprise to most people who thought that they were in the 5th root race. The majority of mankind belongs to the 7th subrace of the 4th root race. The above mentioned Chinaman, and so it goes on. And their offshoots and branchlets, Malayans, Mongolians, Tibetan, Javanese, etc., etc., etc. In fact, the same passage is quoted in Secret Doctrine, where she fills in a few of the etc., etc., etc.'s, and names Finns and Hungarians, I believe, in this list as well. So, yes, the Finns and the Hungarians can take personal offence if they wish. And remnants of other offshoots of the 4th, and the 7th subrace of the 3rd race. And talking of the 5th race, there's another interesting passage where it says, I don't know that I actually quoted it. Yes, I did. On page 118 on 1026. See, these are these sorts of statements which have to be taken, I'm not saying with a pinch of salt, but have to be understood in the sense in which they were meant. I told you before now that the highest people now on earth, spiritually, belong to the 1st subrace of the 5th root race, and that these are the Aryan Asiatics. The highest race, physical intellectuality, is the last subrace of the 5th, yourselves, the white conquerors. He wasn't actually too pleased, I don't think, at what the British were doing to India, the white conquerors. It's not exactly a flattering title.
The white barbarians too.
Yes, yes, so called. Now, one of the things we didn't discuss was the development of the subraces, and it was one of the diagrams that Geoffrey had in his...
the tree.
Yes, the tree, which is on 343, I think, in volume 2.
I was very amused one holiday to find a cactus
Oh,
almost
434.
exactly like that in Spain.
Yes?
Exactly. 7 branches, 7 broad thumbs to it.
434, I'm sorry. I must have seen that in the Astral Light. No. 434 of volume 2.
That's the subraces. Oh, yeah, look at it.
Came out around.
Really? Just like this?
But what do you think? I mean, what? How to put it? All right, the root race, but then the sub races. What those sub races do? I mean,
What do they do? Well, they do anything. They represent stages of development for within the race. You can imagine, if you will, that the race represents the striking of a keynote, and then the sub-races represent so many variations on the principal theme. And within the keynote struck by the root race, then there are 7 primary qualities which then have to be developed and expressed. And what we call the sub-races represent those developments. But if we then try and look at it in terms of sequential time, then you're trying to impose a rather different order on it. If you imagine it as starting from a center and there being like 7 circles emerging from it, then as you can see and you can picture, there would be enormous overlap, but the direction is really from the center outward, out and back in again. So many branches radiating from it, rather like you see in this diagram, just as the parent stem expresses itself in this diagram with 7 branchlets, each of which is a principal expression of something innate, inherent in the stem itself. To think of them as sequential developments in time is to impose a time sequence on it, a linear time sequence. And if you recall what we said about cyclical time earlier, I think it was last week now, this is a perfect illustration. This is a microcosmic illustration of that process. The sub-races within the race represent merely 7 phases within the cycle of the race itself. Then the process is repeated, it seems almost ad infinitum. If you wish to take one sub-race, then you may say that the same is true there. Within the sub-race, there is again a 7-fold raying out from the center of its own qualities. And it's within these that mankind, in his various incarnations, is embodied in order to partake of the qualities of the races, sub-races, and families within these sub-races, and so forth. She does go into time divisions of this, if you're interested, for the 5th race, but whether it's really productive to do that, I have my doubts.
Sure, I think really we really get caught up in a very difficult problem which can so easily fall into this trap of identifying people according to external characteristics and national origins and all the rest. And I think in many ways I wonder if HPB was not herself a bit caught up into this.
Could be.
In her attempt to explain it as clearly as possible, and almost at times seems to fall into this trap. She makes a very derogatory statement about the Australian Aborigines, for example, which really doesn't hold up today with the developments. After all, I think it wasn't that the state of South Australia had an Aborigine as its chief officer or something, it seems to me, but many of the, so it doesn't really hold up, and almost as though she was so 19th century in this, that it was hard for her to separate her own cultural background in the 19th century from the really occult teachings, because at times she goes back to the occult commentary, which indicates this other aspect, and then immediately falls into identifying ethnic groups and national characteristics. It's a very, I think in many ways this has been one of the stumbling blocks that has caused more trouble externally, mainly because we've so misunderstood it.
Right.
And more nonsense being taught.
Oh, yes.
In Italians are good cooks because they are fourth sub-race or something.
Because they are what? Because they are what?
I say they are good cooks only if their mother taught them, if they had access to olive oil.
I mean, after all, our west coast of America is, you see, this uniquely blessed place sort of thing, right? You know, those of us who have the privilege of living there are obviously.
Right. Yeah. Well, do you think we perhaps better draw this to a close? It's now 25 to 6.